Good evening and welcome to NTD News. Here's today's top stories. For the third time this week, a record death toll in New York. Bodies have overwhelmed the city, with temporary burials now happening on Hart Island. We see how the virus is affecting the US military. Infections are on the rise. Stocks are up after the Fed dishes out trillions in loans to help the economy. Some of the money will go to households and businesses. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is out of intensive care but is still in the hospital. This after testing positive for the CCP virus. And concerns are rising that China could soon face a food crisis. Shoppers are hoarding rice and oil, but officials say there's plenty of supplies. New York's hospitalization rate for new patients with the virus is flattening. But for the third time this week, the death toll has reached a record high. NTD's Miguel Moreno has more.
New York may have reached the plateau this week. Overall, the hospitalization rate is falling, but the good news was dashed with another grim record number of deaths.
This virus is very, very good at what it does. We lost more lives yesterday than we have to date.
And the sheer number of bodies has overwhelmed the city. This drone video shows a mass burial underway in Hart Island in the Bronx. The Department of Corrections said about 25 bodies are being buried there 5 days a week. It's an ugly sight, but New York appears to be doing better than the models predicted.
So any of these scenarios are problematic. Luckily, the current trend, if it continues, and if we continue the flattening of the curve, we're at about 18,000 people hospitalized right now.
Despite the news, Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio again reminded New Yorkers that it's not over and that they need to continue social distancing.
The fact that we've seen some initial change, we shouldn't overrate it. We should not count our chickens before they're hatched.
The governor said it could get worse if people relax and talked about the Spanish flu, which killed tens of millions of people in 3 waves. Miguel Moreno, NTD News, New York.
And the number of U.S. service people infected by the virus is increasing. The military says it hasn't affected its combat readiness.
The Pentagon on Wednesday reported its largest 24-hour jump in new virus cases among service members. This brings the force-wide total to nearly 2,000, a number that has doubled in the past week.
But given our demographics of our population, we will also have a lower hospitalization rate.
The military is still combat ready despite reduced training, exercises, and sideline aircraft carrier. The carrier is the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Its 4,800-man crew still being tested, about 400 already testing positive, and over 3,000 testing negative. Planning now underway for possible outbreaks on other ships. And the Pentagon today forced to refute media reports that its National Center for Medical Intelligence knew about the virus sweeping through Wuhan, China as early as November. The info supposedly included in the November internal report. But in a rare public statement, the NCMI says the claims are false, that no such report exists.
Indications we have were the reports out of China in late December that were in the public forum, and the first intel reports I saw were in January.
The sources for the original media report were all anonymous.
And the Department of Justice is urging the FCC not to allow a Chinese telecom company to operate in the United States anymore. The Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and Commerce joined the DoD, among others, in the complaint. The action comes after the DOJ found unacceptable national security risks in the way the company operated. China Telecom is the U.S. subsidiary of a Chinese state-owned firm. Just last week, President Trump set up a committee to review national security concerns about foreign-owned companies, especially those that want access to the U.S. telecom networks. And a divided Senate today in Washington. The chamber failed to pass a new $250 billion aid package for small businesses. This even as unemployment skyrockets.
According to new Department of Labor figures, U.S. unemployment claims soared to a near record high of over 6 million last week.
That means, Mr. President, more than 16 million Americans have lost their jobs
in only the last 3 weeks. A tragedy that is hard to even comprehend.
As lockdowns continue to drive layoffs, an additional $250 billion aid package is working its way through Congress. It's meant to help small businesses cope with the pandemic's economic toll, but on Thursday, the Senate failed to pass it. Democrats objected to a Republican measure aimed at beefing up emergency loans for small businesses. They argued they'd only back the bill if it was coupled with a similar amount for hospitals, local governments, and food assistance.
To my Democratic colleagues, please, do not block emergency aid you do not even oppose just because you want something more.
But Republicans say only the money in a small business loan program was at risk of running out right now and needs to be replenished. It was designed to help struggling restaurants, hotels, and an array of other small businesses. Both sides called for nonpartisanship to get the aid to struggling Americans.
But let's get it done, and let's get it done right, and let's have another 96-0 vote here in the United States Senate.
With most of Congress out on a recess, each side tried to push its respective bill through the Senate on a fast track. That means it took only one objection from any of the 100 senators to shelve either plan.
And the Federal Reserve is providing an additional $2.3 trillion for programs to help the economy. This to make sure state and local governments can provide critical services to homes and businesses. The Fed chairman says if people stay home and health officials come up with a plan to restart the economy, it could recover fairly quickly.
The Federal Reserve injecting another $2.3 trillion into the economy to assist households and employers. The funding will go to help state and local governments deliver critical services during the pandemic. Fed Chairman Powell says we need to have a plan for reopening the economy.
We all want to avoid a false start where we partially reopen and that results in a spike in coronavirus cases, and then we have to go back again to square one.
After the announcement, the Dow Jones surged 285 points, the S&P gained 1.5%, and the NASDAQ rose 62 points.
We do expect to see a very low economic output and big increases in initial claims for unemployment and in unemployment during the second quarter.
The Fed's move is aimed at helping states, along with certain counties and cities, provide services to households and businesses by buying up to $500 billion in bonds from them. Powell says he expects the economy to improve quickly after the virus runs its course.
We would expect there to be a fairly quick rebound as people do go back to work and start resuming normal levels of economic activity. I think most people expect that to happen in the second half of this year after the second quarter.
He says he's not concerned about possible high inflation coming in the near future.
And Saudi Arabia and Russia have agreed on a deal to end their oil price war and stop overproduction. But experts say there's already too much oil on the market for any of it to be any help.
Saudi Arabia and Russia agreed in principle to end their oil price war. They decided in virtual meetings on Thursday to scale back oil production in a market flooded with crude oil and an absence of demand. Oil prices rose as soon as the deal was struck, but then dropped later in the day. The two countries flooded the market with oil starting last month, despite an unprecedented drop in global demand. In what seems like a struggle for the upper hand in the global marketplace, the conflict between the two production giants wreaks havoc on prices. The oil industry is suffering. But the two countries say in order to make the new deal work, they need cooperation from other oil-producing countries, including the United States. But the U.S. says production will naturally fall due to the fall in demand. Other oil producers have not indicated they will cut production. Energy experts say even a cut of 10 million barrels per day won't be enough to end the oil glut. Energy ministers from G20 countries plan to meet Friday to further discuss the oil crisis.
Moving to the UK, news from London tonight that the UK's Prime Minister is out of intensive care but still remains in the hospital. He's been suffering from the CCP virus after testing positive more than 10 days ago. Our UK correspondent Jane Worrell has more.
An update on Boris Johnson's health tonight. He has been moved out of intensive care to the hospital ward and is said to be in extremely good spirits. No further details have been released about his health. Johnson's last public appearance outside before going to hospital was last Thursday, when he joined the UK's weekly clap for healthcare workers. Since going into intensive care, he asked Dominic Raab to deputise for him and lead the UK's response to the crisis. During Thursday's briefing, Raab urged the public to stay at home, saying the measures were not done yet.
Thank you for your sacrifice, but also we're not done yet. We must keep going.
He says lockdown measures will be in place until at least the end of next week, as it's unclear when the UK will be beyond the peak. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
UK deaths have increased by more than 880, bringing the country's total to 8,000. Behind each of them, of course, is a life, a family and friends. And from another angle, moving on to how the World Health Organization, diplomats say it will soon request upwards of $1 billion in funding to fight the global pandemic. It comes after criticism from the Trump administration that the organization spread false information at a critical time.
The WHO says it will put together a new funding plan to fight the CCP virus. Diplomats say the organization will request up to several $1 billion. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said Thursday the organization would release its latest plan in the coming days. On Tuesday and Wednesday, President Trump expressed dissatisfaction with the WHO. He said faulty statements the WHO made in January spread inaccurate information about the virus around the world.
The World WHO, World Health, got it wrong. I mean, they got it very wrong. In many ways, they were wrong. They also minimized the threat very strongly, and not good.
Trump highlighted that the WHO spread misinformation put out by the Chinese Communist regime that there was no human-to-human transmission, despite having information to the contrary. The U.S. is the largest financial contributor to the WHO. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said organizations supported by taxpayer funds must deliver on their promises. Trump and Pompeo said the U.S. would evaluate the effectiveness of the WHO and decide if the funding will continue.
And CCP virus cases are still rising worldwide, but thankfully, the curve is starting to flatten in some European countries.
Russia reported a record one-day rise in virus cases on Thursday, bringing their country's total to more than 10,000. But in some European countries, the rise in confirmed cases is starting to slow down. Italy may start lifting some restrictions by the end of April, provided the slowing trend continues. Germany's health minister said restrictions are working and that their curve is flattening. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said on Thursday that their latest numbers allowed for some hope. However, she cited the head of the Robert Koch Institute when she said there is no reason to relax, because we can quickly destroy what we have achieved. In the Spanish city of Madrid, roads are unusually empty during Holy Week. The military is advancing its disinfection efforts and using drones to disinfect streets. Bored sports fans, take note. The only professional sports league still going in Europe is the Belarusian Premier League. Belarus's authoritarian president has shown little regard for the pandemic. Now you can buy a virtual ticket to watch the game, and your photo will even appear on a mannequin inside the stadium. The money raised will be donated towards fighting the coronavirus.
Coming up, will China soon face a food crisis? People are hoarding rice, but officials are urging them not to, saying the state has sufficient supplies. Find out more after the break.
They were working on developing a coronavirus for the human host. Leads you to question, why would you be creating a coronavirus that can infect humans?
That means virus now can infect human cells much easier.
I noticed that after the outbreak, the Wuhan Institute of Virology kept strangely quiet. Who is the real boss of the P4 laboratory?
I believe they're developing them. I think they want to be the most advanced nation on Earth when it comes to biological weapons.
We want the truth. it's time for the United States to defend itself. The real disease here is communism.
What was the Chinese Communist Party trying to hide?
Welcome back. As China accuses other countries of racism, inside China, Africans are facing discrimination amid the pandemic. NTD's Tiffany Meyer explains.
On April 8th, a large number of African people in the southern Chinese city Guangzhou were driven out by their landlords and had to stay on the streets. Another video shows many Africans dragging their luggage aimlessly through the streets of Guangzhou. One of them says, "We are just walking on the road. They can't give us a house, they can't give us a hotel, and they cannot provide a place we can stay." It comes after all of the cases reported by Guangzhou authorities in April were reportedly related to African people. Chinese media have only reported about testing people from abroad. They haven't talked about testing locals, so we can't rule out the possibility that many of the locals are also infected, but it's not being reported. It's led to discrimination against Africans among local Chinese. One citizen says the Africans staying on the street are a potential safety threat and a virus transmission hazard. Guangzhou is likely going to be a catalyst that ignites southern China. Japan will spend $2 billion to move its manufacturing from China to other countries. Before the pandemic, China was Japan's biggest trading partner. But in February, imports were slashed by nearly half as factories in China shut down. 3 Chinese companies listed on the U.S. Stock Exchange are facing accounting scandals. Last week, Chinese coffee chain superbrand Luckin Coffee revealed that its chief operating officer fabricated about $300 million in sales in 2019. The company's value fell nearly 80% over the next 2 days. China's answer to Netflix, iQIYI, has been accused of inflating its 2019 revenue by over $1 billion. It's reportedly done this by exaggerating its user numbers by 42 to 60% and then faking expenses to explain where the extra revenue went. Investment company Muddy Waters Research supports the accusation. In response, iQIYI agreed its 2019 report contains numerous errors, unsubstantiated statements, and misleading conclusions. The third Chinese company is Beijing-based TAL Education Group, TAL. The company said an employee conspired with external vendors to wrongly inflate light class sales by forging contracts and other documentations. Light class sales accounted for about 3 to 4% of the company's total revenues, or about $90 million in 2019.
And could China be facing a food crisis? People across the nation are stocking up on rice and other staples, while officials try to assure the public there's enough to supply them. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
In cities across China, people are panic buying over fears of a potential food shortage. But Chinese officials are urging the public not to hoard non-perishables like rice. They say there's ample food supply.
The overall supply of grain for this year isn't likely to be a problem. But if people panic buy, even ample grain supplies don't guarantee there won't be hunger or regional food shortages.
Qin says assurances from officials won't help eliminate people's fear. Instead, he says it has the opposite effect, as many don't trust the regime after previous cover-ups and lies.
It's like walking into a trap. The more the government refutes the rumors, the more people become concerned. By refuting the rumors, they think the government is validating their concerns instead.
In addition, it takes time for whole grains to be processed into flour or rice. According to Chinese officials, the stockpiles of refined grain in mid to large-scale cities hold enough to last 10 to 15 days. But widespread panic buying could lead to a gap.
If people panic buy, the originally smooth supply chain will be disrupted, and there could be shortages.
Qin says despite the country's grain stockpiles, individuals could still suffer. In the early 1960s, the Great Chinese Famine wiped out over 20 million people. Many regions also had stockpiles at that time, but didn't release the resources to those in need. Juliet Song, NTD News, New York.
And still to come, a video of healthcare workers opening faulty medical products from China has triggered a scandal in France. More on that when we return.
"90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. This is a battle between truth and deceit. Subscribe today and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board."
Poor quality protective equipment imported from China continues to be a scandal across Europe. Our France correspondent David Vives has the details.
The woman filming this nurse is laughing, but the situation is dramatic. On April 2nd, health workers at Marseille La Timone Hospital had a shock when they opened up boxes of surgical gowns.
These are our new gowns. Just look at this. We just took it out of the box.
According to the woman on the phone, all of the boxes they were supposed to use that day contained gowns that were defective.
We're going to fasten the belt. We already opened 3 boxes.
These health workers work with children infected by the CCP virus. At the end of the video, the nurse says she will go on to test children for the virus. France is lacking personal protective equipment like masks and gowns. In a public hospital, La Timone in Marseille, healthcare workers use a single-use surgical gown for each time they enter a patient's room.
The French government bought 100 tons of medical equipment from China, including protective gowns, on March 29th. The video triggered a cascade of comments on social networks, with many people angry about the quality of the Chinese-made equipment. This is a Europe-wide problem. On April 8th, Finland said 2 million masks it received from China were faulty. David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
And European politicians say the Chinese Communist Party is trying to change the narrative around the CCP virus, but they say they're not buying it. NTD's Germany correspondent Christian Watchen has the details.
After almost 11 weeks on lockdown, authorities in Wuhan are lifting all travel restrictions. For the past several weeks, the CCP has reported 0 or near 0 new infections in the whole of China. But not everyone is convinced the epidemic is truly over.
That the Chinese had supposedly already fought the epidemic. I think this is a fairy tale of the central government in Beijing, which in turn shows what a communist dictatorship does in terms of propaganda to the outside world. This reminds me heavily of Chernobyl.
Criticism is growing over the CCP's failing to contain the virus. Some politicians in Europe point out how Chinese authorities knew about it early on, and how they destroyed virus samples, detained citizen journalists, and silenced doctors who tried to sound the alarm.
Already in November, the first reports within China were forwarded to Beijing and to the health authorities that there is a new lung disease. And typical for a system like China's, which is not democratic and pluralistically set up, they therefore first tried to cover it up.
A study found that if the Chinese regime had acted just 3 weeks earlier, 95% of infections could have been prevented.
If we had had 6 weeks lead time, if the WHO had already issued a warning at the end of November, we would probably not have many thousands of deaths on our books. China must be held accountable.
As countries in Europe continue to struggle with the pandemic and its fallout, some observers see it as a chance to gain more clarity on the CCP's true nature and its intentions. Reporting by Christian Watchen, NTD News, Berlin.
Still to come, rideshare drivers are making much less since the lockdown. But after the break, we see why one driver stays on the road. Welcome back. Rideshare drivers' income is down 80% across the country. Many drivers are off the road altogether to protect against the health risk. But at least one in New York is still helping essential workers get where they need to go. NTD's Kevin Hogan has the story.
Across the country, rideshare drivers losing about 80% of their income due to lockdowns caused by the pandemic. For-hire vehicles are an essential business. Raul, a registered taxi and limousine commission or TLC driver, is hitting the streets. He doesn't turn away any passengers coming or going from the hospital.
I don't panic when I go to a hospital and I'm picking somebody up. I just pick them up. I don't discriminate. I just pick up. Doesn't matter where they're going. I just pick them up.
He doesn't advise anyone to do what he does, but he says he chooses to do it because it feels good to help his fellow New Yorkers.
So we went over to Far Rockaway. We delivered the asthma medication, stood there for a few minutes, and I brought her right back to the Bronx, and she was thankful.
Many rideshare drivers calling it quits to protect their health, and some because there just aren't enough fares. Raul says the city has lost doctors, nurses, police officers, and taxi drivers to the virus.
All New Yorkers. That's what we're losing. We're losing New Yorkers. And I feel, I get emotional when I talk about it like that because I'm one. I'm not Superman. It can happen to me too.
Some New Yorkers say the safest way to travel is on foot, bicycle, or taxi to avoid crowds.
If you have to travel, I think walking would be the best way, obviously keeping a 6-foot distance. But if you're going to do something, maybe a bicycle.
The trains are really a pain in the neck right now because they cut the service drastically, so every train I've been on in the past 2 weeks has been overcrowded.
One woman who recovered from the virus now works from home.
It's like I lost my sense of smell and taste and had some breathing issues, you know, all the stuff. So my husband got it as well, so.
Raul says now that less cars are on the street and less police are out patrolling, more motorists are speeding. As a member of Families for Safe Streets and as a crash survivor, he asked them to stop driving recklessly and for pedestrians to be safe when they're out so that we don't send more to the hospital. Thanks, Raul. Kevin Hogan, NTD News reporting.
That's the updates for now. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Paul Graney.